Okay, guys, what I want to talk about now is Theodore Roosevelt and his life prior to the presidency, and in particular, some lessons that he learned as a young man, as a child even, that informed the way that he conducted himself during his presidency and throughout his life, really. Roosevelt was born in 1858, so by the time the Civil War was halfway over, he was about 5 years old. And his father was a northern businessman, a very successful businessman from New York City, who had met and fallen in love with a legitimate Southern belle, a young woman from Georgia. So here they are living in New York City. The war is being fought. The mom has her mother or grandma up there living with them at the family in New York City because she's concerned for her safety in Georgia. And every night at dinner, Dad is sort of running the dinner table and telling everybody about how we're going to whip those rebels, and here's the conduct of the war, and Lincoln's the greatest, and this and that, and Mom and Grandma don't say a thing. And then when little Theodore is taken upstairs and he gets in his jammies and gets down next to his bed and says his prayers, he's got Mom and Grandma right there. And he told this story many times in life as an old, as when he became an adult. He said, at the end, my mother or my grandmother would always say, now, Theodore, don't you forget those people down there in the South, because they're having a hard time of it right now, and they need your prayers and thoughts just as much as anybody. And then he would, fold his hands again and close his eyes and bow his head and say, and God bless the no good rebels in the South. Amen. Okay, a cute story from childhood. But what's important about it, according to Roosevelt, is that it taught him at the age of 5 that every story has two sides. There's more than one way to look at anything. There is his dad's perspective on the war and his mom and his grandma's perspective on the war. And that's why Roosevelt, as a Republican, would oftentimes behave like a Democrat. He was a conservative who would oftentimes behave like a liberal, because he didn't believe in being stuck in some lifelong ideological position. He believed in looking at a situation or a thing or a problem and just coming to grips with it, not because he was a conservative thinker or a Republican, but just on its own merits. All right, now, Roosevelt also had a lot of health problems as a kid. He had sort of catastrophically bad asthma. He was thin and puny. He stayed inside and read books all the time, and when he went outside, he sat in the bushes with little binoculars and watched birds. He loved bird watching all of his life, even up into his 40s and 50s. But he was a real kind of egghead kid who was very puny and underdeveloped. And at one point, when he was about 12 years old, his father took him aside and said, Theodore, you have a first-rate mind, but your body is going to be a cage that your mind is not going to be able to break out of, because your health is so poor. You're not going to be able to do the many great things that await you in life if you don't do something about your health. So Roosevelt, who was a real daddy's boy, said, what do I do, Pop? And his dad said, I recommend a good program of calisthenics, sit-ups, push-ups, running every day. And he sort of gave the kid, a regimen, a physical fitness regimen. And Roosevelt attacked it as he attacked everything in life with all of his energy and commitment. By the time he was 15 years old, he was this guy that you see before you here, a broad-shouldered, barrel-chested young toughie who was an amateur boxer. And he did so well in terms of exercising himself, up to this point that he exercised himself out of asthma. He overcame asthma. It was gone. Never bothered him again after the age of about 15, 16, for the rest of his life. Now, what's important about this is that Roosevelt believed in the possibility of reform. Reform, very simple word. It means positive change, change for the better. Roosevelt believed in the possibility of changing things for the better because he had changed himself for the better. He had reformed himself, his body, his life. So when he gets into political office in his 20s and then later in his 30s and as president, he's going to believe in his ability and in others, their ability to change things for the better, to fix things, to fix government, to fix society. Okay, that's the second important lesson. Now, the third important lesson that Roosevelt learned had to do with something that his father did, which was that he was a sponsor for an orphanage, a boys' home in New York City. Young guys, kids, boys, they'd lost their families, they had nothing, nowhere to go in life. They'd taken in this boys' home, and his dad would go there every 2-3 weeks, once a month, something like that. He would bring young Theodore with him periodically, and he would counsel these boys, these young men. He always brought them birthday gifts. He made sure they had Christmas presents, and he'd set them up with apprenticeships and jobs so that, when they got too old to be in the orphanage anymore, they would have a way to support themselves, to make their way in life. And by bringing Theodore with him to sort of talk to some of these young men here and there, not every time probably, but then, he was able to talk to his own son and say, we have a lot of advantages in life, Theodore, and you can never forget this, all the great things that are going to come to you just because of our family and the money that we have and my position in society. But what you've got to remember is that there's always people that are lower than you, meaning they're not as high up on the ladder of success, of wealth, of advantage. And so you've got to reach your hand down and help them out. It behooves those who have to help those who have not. And that's another lesson that Roosevelt carried forward for the rest of his life, and that would really inform his conduct, and particularly in his presidency. Okay, now, in 1880, there's Roosevelt's old man. In 1880, Roosevelt graduated from Harvard. 2 years later, he got married, fell in love. Oh no, he actually got married in 1880, pardon me. And 2 years later, in 1882, his young wife died 11 hours, or 2 days, after giving birth to his daughter. And 11 hours later, his mother died in the same house. Okay, so let's reflect on that. On the same day, 11 hours apart, he loses his wife, he loses his mother, he's got an infant daughter that's just a couple of days old. The wife and the mother died of different reasons, different kinds of illnesses, whatever. Clearly, this is a catastrophic moment in anyone's life. Roosevelt kept a diary all his life from when he was just 6-7 years old, and on that day, he only wrote one thing, a great big black X covering almost the entire page and one line at the bottom: "The light has gone out of my life." He's 26 years old. He's been working in New York politics already. He's already run for mayor of New York City. But he can't get over the death of his wife and his mother. He tries for a while. Finally, when his daughter is about 2 years old, in 1884, he decides to go off and be a rancher in Dakota. His sister has a lot of little kids of her own, so he leaves his daughter in the care of his sister and her husband, and he goes out west to be a rancher, and he learns how to shoot, throw the lariat, and gets to hunt a wild wolf pack, and has this whole kind of great Western adventure. But ultimately, the lessons that he learned from his dad, that you need to be of use in society, that you've got to do things to help other people, all this kind of stuff, it sort of pulls him back to New York. He has a nice 2-year adventure, but ultimately he goes back to New York, gets back into politics. In 1888, he is remarried. He's on his way to fathering 5 more children. He gets a position as the Federal Civil Service Commissioner. And then in 1895, he becomes the police commissioner of New York City. New York City was the most corrupt city government at that time in the United States. I mentioned that to you in the last video lecture. The police force was the most corrupt police department. Roosevelt came in determined to clean it up, to reform it. He engaged in regular inspections of firearms. He forced all the police officers to have annual physical exams. He appointed 1,600 new recruits, but only after they had passed stringent mental and physical tests. He put telephones into all the precinct houses. He also went out late at night, like midnight, 2 in the morning, and walked the beat to sort of see if his officers were out doing their job, walking around the neighborhoods and stuff. Some of his early biographers say that he actually got involved in crime fighting and went out and beat up muggers and sort of threw him over his shoulder and brought him into the precinct house and said, "See, this is the way you take care of evildoers." And, later biographers have kind of poo-pooed this stuff. We don't really know if he did that or not. It's a legend, let's say. But what's interesting about it is that there has been some suggestion that the character of Commissioner James Gordon from Batman comics and Batman television show and Batman movies and the show Gotham, if you watch that. There's been some suggestion that Commissioner James Gordon was based on the character of Roosevelt, this crusading police commissioner who's going to clean up Gotham or New York City, one bad guy at a time. I don't know if that's the case or not, but it's a pretty good story, right? All right, now, in 1897, Roosevelt is the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, and in 1898, the Spanish-American War breaks out. Roosevelt wants to go to war. He's a tough guy. He's a macho. He's like a steam engine in trousers, as somebody suggested once. Somebody called him that. I think it was Ida Tarbell. Roosevelt doesn't want to kill random people, but he wants to kill some people. He wants to kill people. He says, I relish the killing of human beings. He wrote that in the letter. What he means is he wants to go to war and prove that he's a real warrior, that he can beat enemies on the field of battle. And now here's a war, man. It's right in front of him. But he's the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. That's not the kind of guy that is allowed to go out and shoot at people and so on and so forth. So what he does is he pulls every string and pushes every button and calls in every favor, and he's able to resign as Assistant Secretary of the Navy and to get an honorary commission as colonel in the Army, even though he's never even been in the Army, and he becomes the colonel of the Rough Riders, a cavalry contingent. And so he goes off into the Caribbean, to Puerto Rico, Cuba. He fights, he kills, he goes to war, he loves it. When he comes back to New York at the end of the summer, September or October, I think it's September of 1898, the Republican Party, they approach him and they say, Theodore, we need somebody to run for governor of New York. You're the candidate, buddy. You're a war hero. You're a legend in your own time. What do you say? Do you want to be the governor? Roosevelt says, well, of course I'd love to be the governor. And so what does he do? He runs for the governor, right, in his cavalry outfit here and all the advertisements. And, of course, he wins. He becomes the governor of New York. Now, it's at this point that the real Roosevelt becomes apparent to the Republican Party, which is to say that he's not a traditional Republican. He's not necessarily a friend of big business. He's interested in doing the right thing. He's interested in being a good governor and serving the interests of the people. And if that irritates the Republican Party or the guys with a lot of money, the big business interests, he doesn't care. Roosevelt has press conferences twice every day so that he could remain connected with the middle class base of his, the voters that really were behind him, really kept the public informed on what it was that he was doing. And he constantly talked about the square deal, how he was going to give everyone a square deal, a square with 4 sides so that everybody was being treated equally. The square deal was defined, this is one way of defining it, just kind of get the sense of this, by honesty in public affairs, an equitable sharing of privilege and responsibility, and subordination of party and local concerns to the interests of the state at large. One of Roosevelt's earliest biographers, Harold Chessman, argued that as governor, Roosevelt developed the principles that shaped his presidency, especially insistence upon the public responsibility of large corporations, publicity as a first remedy for trusts or monopolies, regulation of railroad rates, mediation of the conflicts between capital and labor or strikes, conservation of natural resources, and protection of the less fortunate members of society. Okay, well, at any rate, Roosevelt is governor. The Republican Party, or a lot of the Republicans in New York, are not really sure that they should have ever gotten him in there to begin with. They're a little bothered about the way that he's conducting himself. And at this point, the presidential election of 1900 steps onto the stage of history. William McKinley had been elected in 1896 in what was called the Front Porch Campaign. He ran for the presidency without ever running anywhere. He never went and made a speech. He never left his house, basically. He sat on the porch in the rocking chair. People could make appointments, groups, newspaper reporters, and they could come and talk to him there. His wife would serve tea and cookies, lemonade, but he never left. Why didn't he go out? How could you win the presidency in 1896 and never go and make a speech or do anything? Well, the problem was that the guy that was running for the other party, the Democrats, was this William Jennings Bryan, who had begun as the leader of the Populist Party, a left-wing, very liberal party that was the favorite of miners and farmers. And ultimately, the Populist Party and the Democratic Party kind of they were fused together. They became one party. And Bryan was this legendary speaker. He was larger than life. He had a great big head and an incredibly loud voice, and maybe the greatest speaker, public speaker in the history of the United States. McKinley knew that he was kind of stiff himself and not a very good speaker. He said, I'm not going to go out there and give a speech while Bryan is running like a madman across the land. I mean, I'll just look terrible in contrast. So he never went anywhere. But he still won the election. He didn't win it in a landslide, but he did win. A big part of this is because there was so much money behind him. A very wealthy Republican businessman named Dollar Marcana, if your nickname is Dollar, you know, clearly he had a lot of money, scratch right. Dollar Marcana invested, I've seen some quotes as much as $7 million, I'm not sure. Certainly it was millions. I've seen different sources with different numbers. He invested millions to make sure that McKinley got into the White House, okay? Well, McKinley is running again for re-election in 1900, but he has not been a particularly popular president. He hasn't been a disaster. It's not that he's done a bad job, but he hasn't been very exciting. He hasn't done much of a job at all. And Bryan is running again, and Bryan's more popular than ever. So the Republicans say to themselves, we need a ringer for the vice presidential spot on the ticket. We need somebody to help McKinley win this election. Remember a few years back, guys, when John McCain got Sarah Palin on the ticket with him? John McCain was an old, boring white guy, and Sarah Palin was a kind of attractive, sexy, you know, good-looking, dynamic, younger woman. Okay, that was McCain trying to get the votes that he couldn't get with a vice presidential running mate that could help him out. And in that same election, who did young, inexperienced African-American Barack Obama get? He got an older white dude who was very loose around the collar and relaxed and good with people. Joe Biden, who'd been in Congress for 25 years. People that are running for the presidency always want to put somebody next to them that can help them get the votes that they can't get themselves. So the Republicans go to Roosevelt and they say, Teddy, baby, Theodore, we need you. We need you. McKinley needs you. The country needs you. McKinley's not going to win. We need you for the vice presidency. In 1900, Roosevelt says, what? I don't want to be the vice president. You don't get to do anything as a vice president. It's boring. And Roosevelt has got 10 million watts of energy. He's got things to do. He's doing great things as governor. He wants to do more. He doesn't want to be the vice president. But they say to him, Teddy, Theodore, do you want Bryan in the White House? Roosevelt says, he's not fit to be president. And they say, yeah, and you're the only guy that can stop him. Are you a good Republican? Are you a Republican like your dad was, like Lincoln was? You know, are you loyal to the party? Well, ultimately they convince him. Roosevelt says, okay, I'll do it. And so here you have it. Roosevelt McKinley running in 1900. And they win. Of course they win. Once Roosevelt, the big war hero, the famous police commissioner of New York, the governor, they win. They win, right? But before they made the ultimate decision to get Roosevelt on the ticket, a bunch of these powerful Republicans were hanging around and talking things over. And Dollar Marcana said, look, guys, do you realize that if we put this man in the vice presidency, then there is only one life between him and the White House? In other words, what happens if McKinley dies? Everybody says, come on, McKinley's healthy as a horse. Get out of here, Hannah. It's going to be fine. He says, all right, you know what? Okay. 6 months into their term, McKinley is assassinated. Yeah, he's assassinated. Shot in the guts, dies. He doesn't die immediately. It takes a while. Everybody in the country is waiting to hear the news of, is McKinley going to live? Is he not? A bunch of powerful, wealthy Republicans are up in some penthouse or something on Fifth Avenue, drinking cognac, smoking stogies, and waiting for the news, talking over politics. Dollar Marcana is there. And the news comes in. They get a phone call. Some guy runs in. I don't know when. They said, McKinley has breathed his last. He's dead as a doornail. And Roosevelt's taking the oath of office. The story, I don't know if it's a true story, but it's a good story. The story is that when the news came in like that, Marcana, all the blood came out of his face. He just blanched. He fell down into a chair and looked at everybody and said, now that goddamned cowboy is president. Yes, they didn't like it when he was running the state of New York, and now he's going to be running the United States of America. What will happen next? Well, your book is going to tell you about that, or your book has told you about that, depending on where you're at in the reading. I'm not going to talk about the presidency of Theodore Roosevelt, but we are going to talk about him just a little bit more in the next video lecture.